Good morning. I'm Amitava Michael Kundu, and the presentation that I'm about to begin will be my final submittal for the EDU 585 History and Philosophy in Education course. I will be dealing exclusively with exploring strategies to improve learning in the brand new world of online and virtual education. So back in 1964, a Canadian philosopher and communications expert, Marshall McLuhan, first used the phrase global village. As a matter of fact, he also predicted the emergence of the World Wide Web over 30 years before it actually occurred. But I think the thing that McLuhan was the most famous for was a statement that he made that the medium is the message. And what McLuhan meant by that was that the medium used to convey messages often helped to shape that message itself. And I think the reason that's so interesting to me is because this discussion about the emergence of online communication, in particular the application of online communication within the school system, actually is often shaped by the medium itself. So in order to make this presentation much more salient and relevant to what I'm talking about, I'm actually going to be using a mix of multimedia in this presentation. So you'll have a PowerPoint display, and you'll also have a combination of photography, video, audio, as well as the traditional prose, just to give an idea of how the medium is actually used in communication. So with that, let's begin, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. So let me talk a little bit about why this has relevance to me and what makes me interested in this particular medium. Well, during my teaching certification program, I spent over 800 hours teaching in a classroom exclusively online. So I taught from Western Washington. My students were in Eastern Washington. And this really gave me an insight to some of the challenges in the emerging field of online education and how we might be able to address some of these challenges. It was a pretty interesting experience, and it got me thinking a lot about what the strengths of the medium were and what the potential issues that we need to learn to overcome in this medium would have been as well. And that is the basis of this paper. So I think in order to frame this presentation and the issue correctly, I would give you an example of what an online classroom would look like. So this was the classroom that I taught last year, and it was a grade 6 cohort, and essentially the entire classroom was taught online. So we used Zoom as a platform, but here's an example of what we're talking about the issue of learning online versus learning in a physical classroom. Let's think for a couple of seconds on this particular thinking prompt. Lily, go ahead.
There are actually quite a few environmental issues.
Cool.
So that gives you a lot of options.
It does. It does. Do you have one in particular that you think that you would choose to write about?
Um, if I would have to choose one, I'd probably choose illegal animal hunting of like endangered animals.
Oh, like poaching, you mean?
Because like they're already endangered. Why
Yeah.
try to make them extinct?
Do you
Just
think
let
that's
them breed more, and then you can hunt them again.
yeah?
Because then they're not extinct anymore, or they're not endangered.
I think that's an excellent area. So right off the bat, there were a couple of observations that could be made from this example. One, the imagery of the students, in some cases, you didn't even see their faces. So student positioning is a critical one. And part of the reason that's so important is because we'll talk a little bit more about communication and nonverbal communication and body language and so forth. And so the struggle in some students who do not sit in front of their cameras or those who actually keep their camera off, that's one. The second one is that the verbal cues in dialogue don't really work that well when you're on a computer environment either. You saw that there was some talking over, some hesitation about being able to start a comment when the other person wasn't quite finished yet. That happens as well. And then third, you've got to be aware of text messages that come in individually or perhaps group chat, and at the same time continue the interaction with the students. So there are a bunch of different elements that we're just starting to get introduced to in how online communication within a classroom environment is completely different and sometimes a little bit more challenging than face-to-face communication. When you take into consideration that the online learning environment has only existed for about 2 decades, that really doesn't provide a long time for us to be able to do any longitudinal studies on the impact or the changes on students in today's society. I had an excellent opportunity to experience online learning firsthand because I spent over 800 hours teaching an online class last year in the Wenatchee School District.
So I think one of the biggest challenges of being exclusively online probably revolves around student engagement. It became pretty clear pretty early on in my involvement in this program that a number of our students, the Internet Academy had a policy of allowing students to keep their video cameras off. And so it was often very difficult for us to assess whether the students were actually paying attention, or as my mentor teacher indicated, that she was aware that in many cases the kids would turn on their computers and they would simply go into another room, play video games, or become alternatively engaged, but really not focused on their lessons. So there's always a danger of that. Unlike in a corporate meeting where everybody's got their camera on for the most part, a lot of times students don't need to be directly engaged. And that might be particularly true in an alternative program anyway.
Certainly, in the context of all the challenges of online education, attentiveness and student focus is probably the largest concern. Now, there has been some discussion about the psychosocial changes in an online learning platform versus a face-to-face platform, but as you'll see in later discussions, in many cases, students are actually much more conditioned to being able to work and interact in online environments, specifically students from today's society who are deemed as being digital natives.
So let's talk a little bit about the psychosocial aspects of internet technology versus real face-to-face technology. So on the internet, we might assume that students are not able to interact as effectively as they would in a face-to-face environment. The one aspect that I think we really need to consider is that there may be some psychosocial differences, but interactivity may not necessarily be one of them. The fact is that students today, particularly in the elementary grades and middle school grades, they are digital natives. They grew up with this technology. They know how to socialize. Their instant messaging capabilities are geometrically beyond what we can even imagine, and they develop relationships and they interact continually on a real-time basis, sometimes in the middle of the night, with their peers. And so even though we think that these students may be socially isolated, the fact is, with the internet and with their ability to navigate this platform, they are definitely not isolated. They've learned how to adapt, and they are in a completely different mind space than those of us in the hybrid generation or the physical native generation might be. So there are some psychosocial differences between today's platform communications and what we may be familiar with, but the reality is they have not really handicapped students too much.
So in the bottom right of this particular slide, you'll see a screenshot of another online classroom, and this is a grade 6 classroom once again. And what you'll notice right off the bat is the majority of the students do in fact keep their screens off during class time. And this is really something that impacts their psychosocial development in a sense, not just simply between the teacher and the students themselves, but even among the students as a cohort. There is not that much interactivity or the ability to read the body clues and other communication modalities of students in your own class. So this is one element of what we are referring to as the variances in the psychosocial picture of an online classroom.
Come here, girl. Come on. Good girl. They say that 93% of our ability to communicate is nonverbal, meaning that body language is the best tool that we have to convey emotionally charged messages to others. Now, do you believe that's really true? And if so, how does the internet and online platforms like Zoom or TikTok either improve or make it harder to really understand what your classmates or your teacher might be saying? So do you really believe that you can effectively communicate over a computer screen?
Educational researcher Tim Noster once said that building rapport with students is a foundational step in ensuring positive classroom management. And I think that one of the most important things we need to understand is that today's generation of students are known as digital natives, according to researcher Francis Ball and his colleagues. And that means that they are effectively capable of socializing and developing a social presence through the internet. And those of us, teachers and so forth, come from a field of physical natives. We come from a completely different environment. We are much more used to interacting face to face. And I think this is probably one of the critical differences of working in a two-dimensional environment versus a three-dimensional environment. And we need to function in a way that we can still effectively communicate. In this video, I did a couple of things. One, I kept glasses on to minimize eye contact. Now, eye contact itself is very challenging over the internet anyway, but I also minimized gestures. And I was still able to get across some ideas, particularly because of a combination of my voice tone, inflection, and so forth. But these are all additional tools that somebody who uses digital platforms needs to be able to cultivate and successfully apply when they are working with students. So in discussing the relationship to education, specifically about some of these key concepts, we're talking about perceived autonomy, competence, and relatedness. How do we accomplish that as an educator in the classroom? Well, here's one strategy. Create an environment where you're making the students imagine that they are in a place or they are conducting a project where they have control, where they've got the autonomy to actually manifest the ideas that you are trying to give them a talking prompt to discuss all together. The other aspects of it is you put them in a situation where they're looking at you in the field, perhaps giving instructions in an external environment, something that stimulates them, something that gives them a reason to think, hey, you know what? Teacher's outside, so I may as well make my mind go to places where I really want to go. So you're giving that level of autonomy back to them, and you're giving them a sense of having self-directed learning in the classroom. So they're taking on their own projects, and they're becoming motivated in that capacity. Here is an example of an assignment that you can offer to the students that does precisely that.
So students, you'll recall that last week we talked a little bit about owls and where you could find them and what sort of signs you might want to look for if you're actually searching for owls in a field. So the homework assignment that you're going to be working on is a combination of both science and some creative writing. This is going to be an interesting opportunity for you to actually address what we talked about last week. So you're going to incorporate some of the biological learnings that you did about finding owls during the diurnal periods of the day. So we're talking about early morning and late in the afternoon towards evening. And then you're going to incorporate that and pretend that you are personifying somebody like Thoreau or one of the great outdoor writers, and you're going to create a creative piece of writing, about 250 words, that talks a little bit about the science of finding owls in the environment, and at the same time you're going to express it in a prose-like fashion so that you're actually producing a piece that people will enjoy reading. So with this assignment, remember you've got a 250 word limit, and at the end you're going to actually read it aloud to the class. So this will also have a presentation component to it. So continue to work on your homework assignment, and remember it's due in precisely 7 days. Good luck. So when we talk about social presence online, what does that really mean? Do you think that you've got more friends on the internet, more acquaintance, better relationships? Or would you prefer to have friends in real life, friends in the physical environment? So which relationships do you think are better? Do you think there's any downfall of relationships on the internet? Do you think the internet makes it easier for people to find new friends, to make new friendships, and have some quality relationships?
Well, it's certainly difficult not to accept the emergence of today's technology as an evolution in the way we do things. And certainly with the conditions that we're seeing in school environments, and I've mentioned some of them before, it makes sense that we do incorporate more and more of hybrid, if not 100% online teaching in certain circumstances. Certainly, I think we need to recognize that students who grow up in the era of technology, as mentioned before, have become digital natives. In a sense, they're used to living in a world where technology is a fundamental part of everything they do. Those of us, of course, who come from a previous generation, we are the hybrids. We are the ones that have lived in worlds that had both the interaction, the physical interaction, as well as the emergence of technology, and we've learned to embrace it. So in a sense, we do have a different context altogether. But of course, the elder generation, those that may be one generation older than us, are the physical natives. They're the ones that really see technology as a completely newfangled idea, and they may be a little bit concerned about the impacts of that technology on students. That itself is a disparity that we need to be aware of, that there are different perspectives within the hierarchy of a school system and a school leadership administration, perhaps, because the generational ages are different. We have to take that into consideration. And there are definitely, like I mentioned with the social emotional learning, some aspects of non-face-to-face communication that we do need to reinforce within our students. It is an interesting new world that we are entering. So the operative concept here, in relationship to different philosophical schools of thought, is that the emergence of the internet and digital communications has simply expanded the reach of a student, thereby compressing their world into a much closer, accessible medium. And that simply means that the exosystem, the friends, the relationships, the things that they can be exposed to have expanded to the sense, and that also increases their macro system to the point where things that occur in different parts of the world, perhaps even off-world, in outer space, in the moon, on the planets, and that sort of thing, that really, really expands a kid's reach to be able to experience and write about and learn about some of these different concepts.
So imagine for a moment as an educator that you had the ability to take your students to any location at all in the world. You could take them to Antarctica, to the Serengeti, or maybe even a small little island off the west coast of British Columbia called Haida Gwaii. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is a particular tool. It's called Google Arts and Culture that essentially allows you to do that. It's virtual reality. So it opens up the entire world for your classroom. You could take them to any location you happen to teach about or that might fall into your curriculum. Incredible opportunities today, and we're going to learn a little bit more about it.
Without getting too involved in a discussion about the merits of virtual or augmented reality, I did want to bring up one aspect of their value in a classroom today, particularly in classrooms where you might be faced with budget shortfalls and you don't have the ability to get your students to go out on field trips. Virtual reality, using Google Arts and Culture and a variety of other platforms, there's lots of them out there that you can apply, really give you an opportunity to do a virtual field trip. And it's not simply a field trip where students go and look at pictures in a predetermined recording, but some of these virtual reality tools that are used, such as the Oculus Rift glasses and so forth, they will allow a student to actually get in and immersively travel through the interactive environment in whatever direction that they wish to travel in. So they actually have some agency over what they're doing in that environment. All right, now we're going to take a very quick tangent and discuss how this actually has a relationship to my personal philosophy of education, because I really believe in this idea of virtual reality, and I plan on using this stuff. And here is a little bit more information about how it can actually be applied. Hey, do you all remember those Oculus Rift headsets that came out a few years ago? Well, they're still being used, and they still are at the forefront of virtual reality. And the beauty of them is that they're not that expensive, and you can certainly incorporate those into your classroom as well. And students wearing those can actually take one step further into the environment, and it becomes more than simply a 2D computer screen, but they're actually stepping into an environment in a virtual setting where they can move forward, move sideways, and interact in ways that a computer may not yet have reached the capability of doing. And the cool thing about that is that it engages the student to take even a further step in and explore environments like the Florence Cathedral or the Space Needle or even the Matterhorn, as you see in some of these examples. And that adds a new element in gaining their interest and gaining their engagement in actually taking on some of these virtual reality trips. And now here's just a little bit more about the immersive part of the virtual reality tool.
So come with me over to the arvr.google.com page, and you'll enter the virtual reality setup. If you do a Google search, you can also get to this page. And let's scroll down and take a look at the Earth virtual reality site. So let's go ahead and click on that site. And when we get there, you'll see a very quick snapshot entry page, similar to the screen that I showed on one of my PowerPoint slides. And let's scroll down a little bit further to talk specifically about the 3 different ways that you can use this. So as you'll see, let's start back at the beginning here. There's the walk around feature, which essentially is the ability to put on a pair of Oculus or Oculus Rift or other virtual reality glasses, and you can walk around an environment virtually. So that means you can look up, look down, look around in 360-degree formats and so forth, and you can actually explore the entire environment. Another option is if you have the right items that come with that Oculus Rift product, you can actually fly around the environment. So this is great for things like the Matterhorn or different ecological biomes that you might explore, and you could direct yourself into different areas. Now, the third option is to simply browse through an area. So that would require you to actually use one of these tools that Google does provide with the Oculus Rift, pick a place on the Earth, and then simply go there in a virtual sense. So you would be exploring that area in the same way using around the walk around function as well. So those are some pretty neat ways to immerse yourself into an environment and get a little bit more engaged and interactive with the different things that are photographed and put onto that virtual reality page.
So now let's move on to looking at how this digital technology may actually help a student in their future career initiatives as well. And then finally, it's important to add a caveat that we have to recognize that a digital divide does exist, and this next slide will also touch base on the disparity in access to technology that we as educators must remain aware of.
So another way to actually engage your students in getting them involved in creating content, not just simply viewing it, is to use technology like drones.
Ultimately, as a teacher, one of the things that you want to do is transition your student not just simply to consume video and presentations and that sort of thing, but to get them involved in creating content as well. So by giving them technologies that are available, such as drones, such as different video cameras, and the ability to record video, whether it's on the computer or directly in the environment, you can actually help facilitate creating the inspiration for students to be able to actually produce products that they can learn and use in the real world, whether they're giving a presentation or whether they're just simply expressing themselves. So there's a lot of different potential in allowing students to get a chance to use some of these different technologies as well.
So somewhere behind me in the forest, there's probably cougars, there's probably coyote, who knows, there might even be a Sasquatch back there somewhere. But what I'm talking about now is the power of place, the power of virtual reality, and being able to take your students to places that they may not necessarily ever be able to get to themselves. So I'm talking about in the middle of the ocean, up on the top of Mount Everest, or in other locations where the students have always desired to be able to learn about, someplace that may inspire them to write, to generate creativity. And that is the power of virtual reality. That's the power of place. You're not limited to simply your local community. Using the internet, using augmented reality, you can take your children out here. You can take the students out and have them write about a place that they've always wanted to visit. That is what generates motivation. That's what gives students agency.
So about 15 years ago, I started becoming a guide for family and friends on sea kayak expeditions up in British Columbia in the Broughton Archipelago. And part of the reason I did that was because I wanted to introduce people to whales, to ecosystems out in the wilderness, and to the Kwakiutl culture, simply because I knew that the more people who got involved to actually see some of these things firsthand, they would become conservationists. They would become stewards. They might become activists. but they would definitely become voters who would vote to protect the environment. So for me, there's a belief system in introducing and teaching people about the world, not just about nature, but about different cultures, about exploration, about history, about science. And so the whole concept of being able to use the internet as a tool to help others learn is something that's very consistent with my own personal beliefs and values. So the reality here is that I believe that technology is going to take us into places where we can actually grow students, we can grow the next generation, hopefully to become active stewards, become a little bit more cosmopolitan in their views, maybe become more tolerant when they're exposed to different cultures. So there's a value here, and this is very consistent with my own personal beliefs and values system.
So let me talk a little bit about what inspired me to kind of pursue this whole angle of education. Interestingly enough, this began over 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, when I was graduating from Ryerson University in Toronto. I was in a film and photography program, and I envisioned the concept of these simulacrum environments in which you could create, using video and audio, an environment in which a viewer would be able to follow a narrator through a figurative journey in a wilderness area. And back then I pictured the area that I had in mind was Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands. It's a beautiful wilderness island off the west coast of British Columbia, far north in the province. And I imagined that we would start on the beach and the narrator would turn around to the camera and talk to the audience and say, all right, which direction do you want me to go? We're going to go into the rainforest here, or we'll continue along the beach. And with every decision made by the viewer, it would incorporate an element, and the video would be different. So the video could take you along a beach. It might show you the beautiful ruins of old cedar canoes, maybe an ancient Haida fishing village, or you could turn into the rainforest and you might stumble across black bear feeding in a small stream area, or perhaps the ruins of a Haida village with longhouses and totems that had fallen down across the flat areas of clearing. So that whole idea of being able to immerse yourself in the culture, immerse yourself by virtual reality 30 years ago, imagine the concept, started me thinking about how we could use this as a teaching tool. And I keep thinking back to that inspiration, that idea, that project that I envisioned back over 3 decades ago. And I started thinking that that might be precisely the kind of thing we can do now, technically, with some of the tools that we have in virtual reality. So that brings us to the last element. What questions do I still have? Well, certainly, probably the biggest one is, how do we address, as a society, the digital divide? We might see technology coming down in cost, but the reality is that it still has a significant amount of inequity in different parts of the world, even here in the United States. So that still remains to be one key question. The other questions I have, well, let's talk about those.
So I've addressed the issue a little bit about the concern about the digital divide, but some of the other questions I have include, are we producing a generation of psychosocial hermits? In a sense, we have talked about how students can adapt to socializing on the internet, but the reality is that there is still some fundamental diminishment when we don't have the physical contact. So that's a question I have. The additional question I have, and this is a big one for me, is that if we keep kids focused on the computer environment and they don't get out and they don't really experience the world in a real context, do they develop a lack of appreciation for the real world? And the reason this is important to me is because I've had the ability through the course of my life to take people out, students as well as adults, into the wilderness, show them whales, show them bears, talk about anthropology, talk about the history of cultural aspects of wilderness. And what I've seen is that people who come with me on those excursions, they develop a stewardship personality where they actually become environmental voters, where they champion the environment, where they actually collectively become activists to a certain extent, but much more than if they simply saw all of this business on a computer screen. So that's a concern for me. I don't want to impact the development of people from being truly able to appreciate what it means to be outside. And then another one and this is kind of interesting, is do we need to amp up our social emotional learning? And then, if not for students, this is actually quite critical. What about for teachers? What about for teachers? Teachers are going to be working in this new realm, and some teachers may need help in understanding how to interact more effectively with emotional intelligence and social emotional learning with their students. So perhaps we're going to be moving forward into a world where teaching SEL and emotional intelligence to teachers, particularly those of the physical native generation, will become necessary. And then another question that comes up in my mind is, what about dependency? What if we have a massive technological failure? What happens if the internet crashes? Do these students who've become completely ingrained in doing things electronically, do they lose out at that point? Does everybody collapse? Does society just effectively break down? So these are just some of the questions I have.
In my mind, there's no question that incidents like COVID, reduced school funding, political changes, and so can really impact the future of education. And I'm convinced that online teaching is the way of the future. I do believe that there may be more hybrid classes, but I do think that unfortunately, face-to-face education is probably diminishing in today's world. So what can a teacher do? Well, a teacher can prepare themselves by learning how to change and adapt to the online world and look at some of the aspects of nonverbal communication, how to enrich students and encourage them to kind of explore the medium, how to build student motivation and engagement, and actually how to continue to have students working in positive forms that they can still socially interact with their peers as well as their teachers.
So in summarizing this project, I've come up with a concept that I believe that we are entering into as a realm of society, and that concept is what I term sensory compression. What this basically means is that we are taking all the experiences of our 3D world, interactive environment where we're actually physically going through things and experiencing things, and we're compressing those into a format that we can portray and we can pass out to others through the internet. And so that sensory compression is going to have a huge change in the way that students learn if they are predominantly using the internet and the computer screen as their medium of message, so to speak. That's what we're at. I think that's the way the world is going. We have to recognize that we are simply passengers on this ride. We can't really steer it in any way. And so the best thing we can do is become skilled and develop those resources and teach our students to develop the resources in order to live in this world where sensory compression is a reality. Thank you for your attention. I hope this presentation was useful. It certainly was very educational for me myself in producing. So there you have it. Enjoy.